One of my friends in the front row thought I was giving the lecture when my name was called out. I was like, no, it's okay. So welcome here. It's great to have so many of you here in person. And hello to everyone that's viewing this live streamcast across Bell Lab sites globally. And I was thinking earlier as well, in the future, we'll have future people looking at this in the past, in this recording. And I'd like to let you know that 2017 is just as messed up in reality as you've read about in your textbooks. So don't worry about that. So thank you all for being here. Just a couple of notes before we start. The fire exits are left and right of the main stage here, and left and right of the front of the building as you entered, and the restrooms are at the front of the building too. And just to finish on a thought before I introduce Marcus, is that I read an article today, and there was a big academic study done recently where they had a perfect linking between someone's phone ringing in a setting like this and stupidity. It's a perfect correlation. So I just want to let you know, all of you are super smart and you've put a lot of effort into building up your intelligence profile, but you could ruin it in a split second here. So please turn your phones to silent out of respect for the audience and our speaker. So with that, Marcus, I'd like to introduce you as the President of Bell Labs and our Chief Technology Officer at Nokia.
I'm going to fire you. You're getting too good at this. There's nothing left for me to do. No, Dunal, thanks very much. This is going to be a lot of fun. I normally have looked up fun facts about the speaker, but there aren't any. So I'm actually going to speak the truth this time. We came across Stephen through Beatty, who's sitting down here, and those of you who know who Beatty is, she's our preeminent experiments and art and technology collaborator, and we'll be launching her album from back there in the anechoic chamber tomorrow. Round of applause for Beatty. And it is a super good album, and I'm saying that even though she's sitting there. So log in, it'll stream in 360-degree live AR, and it's a phenomenal piece of work. And you'll see it, the record will actually be spinning in the anechoic chamber, so you'll feel very Bell Labsian and connected to it. So that's tomorrow at 11 a.m. But enough about that. It was Beatty who said, you know, I've met Stephen Friend, and he's super. He's just amazing. He's a really good guy. You should get to know him. So we had a call, and immediately I think we hit it off. So the best thing I can say about him is he has two defining characteristics that I think are superb. One is he went to Harvard, and we all know the best people went to Harvard. Well, he was on the faculty at Harvard, so he was actually superior to me. But secondly, he's a classic Bell Labsian person. As Chris just said to me, he's a genius. And we rate people fairly highly in Bell Labs. We pride ourselves on being smarter than the average bear. But he really is. I've got to know him a little bit more. The team spent the day with him and had dinner with him last night and think he's a truly remarkable human being, and I concur, and I think you're going to find that in the talk. I'll say a little bit about why he is that way, and this is going to be where I make it up. Other than growing up in the Midwest, which inevitably makes you solid, he then obviously went to Harvard. He worked at something called the Whitehead Institute and discovered the first tumor suppression gene with a team in 1986. He then did a number of things, including founding a company called Sage Bionetworks that was premised on the idea of having open tools and platforms that allowed researchers to share data. Imagine the novelty of that concept, right? That they would share medical data so you could actually learn from each other as opposed to keep them in silos and write individual papers that essentially didn't ever see the whole picture. In that Sage Bionetworks work, he's also started something called the Resilience Project, which allows you to actually tell you what's not wrong with you. And I'll explain that a little bit in my limited understanding. Rather than asking the sick people why they're sick, you ask the people who are genetically similar to them, meaning they're a relative or they have the same genome to a good approximation, why they're not sick. And then you look at the things that essentially have allowed them to remain healthy despite the presence of some gene that should have actually caused a condition. So that's the Resilience Project. And then there's a DREAM initiative where he basically puts out grand challenges for can we solve these problems together in a collaborative way. So all of that in his work at Sage, which he remains, I think, chairman of the board and co-founder and head guru. But he's now at Apple, also helping them figure out what makes sense in healthcare in terms of measuring using some of these wearable devices and what does not, in other words, really putting them on a solid footing. We hope he puts us on a solid footing because we have ambitions to understand human physiology as we've shared before. So without any further ado, What I will call him is a true Bell Lab, sir, even though it's his first visit here. So welcome to the stage, Stephen, and we look forward to this very much.
Delightful introduction, and it comes on top of a delightful week. I've been here since Monday. As you heard, the engagement that has been going on with the use of the raw space project, BD Wolf, and that sort of began some of those interactions with people here at the lab. But the time that was spent, that was set up by Sanjay and others to explore, not just at a scientific, but an artistic level, what was going on, et cetera, this week. There couldn't have been a better way to get in the mood and to see what was going on. So we'll see what happens from that. So the title here, The Future of Human Agency, Exploration of the Role of Art and Technology, is one that I had help. Marcus, thank you for getting some clarity into this title. What I'm going to try to do is to weave some themes together that have to do with how we think, what we're responsible for in technology and in art. And to do that, if you want to sort of know where we are in the talk, I'm going to be spending time talking about digital codes that encode life and how we can actually probe those to identify therapies in ways you might not anticipate. I'm then going to switch over, and I'm going to look at other digital codes and this important opportunity to navigate between health and disease, the 362 days that hopefully you're not in the presence of a physician. I'm going to move over to how our lives are being controlled. People are planning on controlling them. The role of agency and free will. And that's going to sort of allow me to go into some aspects of trust and fear that I think are appropriate today in our world, particularly the last 106 days or whatever. And the role of art and technology in determining awareness and free will. So from the Egyptian and Taoist texts to Homeric tales and Nordic sagas, from Shakespearean plays to looking at Germanic opera, we have this sense that what happens to us, to others, those around us, are somehow being driven by some element of nature and nurture. It's something that has been described as fate. It's been described as destiny. But this concept of what is that about? What element of that is really coming from nature? What is coming from nurture? Is something that in the last 100 years we've actually made some progress. It's a different way we're looking at it than if we were sitting here 100 years ago. And in a simplistic way, my guess is that most of you in the audience sort of have this idea of, well, it's a little more nature, it's a little more nurture. So this idea that things such as Down syndrome or hemophilia are likely to be genetic. And when you get over to tuberculosis or scurvy, it's more environmental. I think we carry around in our head some sort of template that says, oh, that's something which is more genetic. That is something that's more about nurture. I'm going to try to blow that up. I'm going to try to realize the simplicity of that. It's a good rubric, but it's potentially simplistic. And to do that, I want to go back about 100 years. I want to go back to when monks and scientists were close in terms of what they were looking at. I want to go back to Mendel. And he did a remarkable experiment that I think somewhere in your education you probably ran across, which is this concept that he did growing peas. And looking at what happened to the progeny when you had peas that were one color or one shape, and the laws of segregation in terms of genetic information. You have to understand we're literally conjuring up ideas. These are really theories. There's very little data other than the fact that this appeared to happen that could back it up in terms of the physical reality that was making that happen. And this description, I think, is appropriate, where hereditary traits are transmitted by small elements called genes. Okay, I think that's familiar. These genes are carried in rod-like bodies, chromosomes, and a large number of genes lying side by side along the length of the chromosome. Chromosomes occur in pairs, and an individual obtains one chromosome of each pair from his mother and the other from his father. So I show that for two reasons. I show it because it's a good definition, it's coherent, it's from that time. But there's another reason. This is the Shannon Lecture. And after Claude Shannon did his spectacular master's thesis, the one that some people say was maybe the world's most influential master, what do? You've done your master's thesis. And so what are you going to do next? Well, it depends upon where you are. And he was in the presence of Vanderveer Bush. And at that time, it was looking at who could do what in what project. And Vanderveer Bush had a lot to do with the war effort. But also, he was with the Carnegie Foundation, and he was interested in trying to move other fields along. And he said, this guy's a really sharp whippersnapper. Let's see if he could maybe add an algebraic concept to something that's really emerging, to concepts of genetic. So that was excerpted from Shannon's PhD thesis, that description of heredity. And the part that I like is the ending of his introduction, where he says, hereafter, we shall speak, therefore, as though the genes actually exist, and as though our simple representation of hereditary phenomena were really true. Since so far as we are concerned, this might just as well be so. That's a pretty big, I'm going to fill in the blank a little bit. And we will omit, I like this, we will omit from consideration mutations, right? Let's not worry about mutations, and let's not worry about the sex chromosomes. So let's dial forward to 80s, 40 years later. And I want to use a little personal vignette, but it's one that was illustrative of what many people were doing. So for clinician scientists who were used to thinking of diseases as things you looked up in books and they had pictures with a description and you matched the symptom, the idea of actually finding that gene that Claude described as it's real, right? And finding the gene and finding the mutation was quickly becoming something that wasn't hyperbole, wasn't science fiction. But it was at the edge of that in the 80s. And at that time, I was a resident Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, interested in oncology. And father came into an examining room with a young boy who had an obvious defect in his left eye. And that was sad, but it was made more poignant by the fact that if you looked at the data, it was clear that he also actually had a left-sided eye lesion, which in fact was that he had the same lesion. He passed it on to his son. He knew he had. And that was a pretty heavy burden for him to bear. And out of those moments, I think, come that yearning to do things differently. Sometimes something like that, and it sure changed what I was doing and led my interest when I got up to Children's and Harvard during fellowship to try to work on that project. And we were lucky for several reasons. The first was from a mathematician, scientist, Al Knudsen, who I got to know, who did a very simple thing. He took all the cases that had been coming in the hospitals of retinoblastoma, extremely rare tumor, a couple of hundred, maybe 300-400 people with retinoblastoma in the country at any one time. And he plotted the age at which they were getting their tumors, very young, under age of 2 through 6, 7, 8 years of age. This is in months, not years. And noticed that those individuals that got bilateral disease were getting those tumors at a different, earlier when there was bilateral than unilateral, and could see that there was a one-hit, two-hit model here that suggested that there wasn't some activation of a single event, but maybe the chance of getting retinoblastoma was determined by the loss of 2 functions. If you were born with only 1 there, that risk was extremely high, and came up with this hypothesis that maybe there were genes which, if you were to disrupt them, that could cause cancer. Not activations, not oncogenes, but actually this theory that was out there. And the field had moved along significantly. It was rather ripe to the extent where people were looking at patients' chromosomes, and they began to find one chromosome, 13th chromosome, where there was a segment that in some patients, the deletion, or the sort of error, was so large that you could actually see it under a microscope. So there was a sense, somewhere on 13 is something that's going to matter. And what was needed to do to basically clone out in those days was you would find a fragment that you could somehow label, and you could mesh it so that you could see whether the DNA from that piece was there at a DNA level or an RNA level. So in this instance, you could label a fragment from where you think that gene was. You could go in and probe tumors and find out whether the edges of the gene were intact and something was missing in the middle. Then you'd know that it wasn't the neighboring gene. So you could do that at a DNA level. Similarly, you could take the expressed genes from a retina, shown there as RET, or tumors, and you could show that there was some gene that you had a good clue was there that was clearly not there in the tumors and otherwise there. And so that led to the hypothesis that there was a gene there that could allow one to be susceptible, if altered, gave susceptibility to retinoblastoma. The same issue in nature, same time. Lou Kunkel had figured out there was a gene for muscular dystrophy. They put those papers together. Francis Collins, who runs the NIH, 2 weeks later had an article that for cystic fibrosis, they found the gene for that. So it was like one of those times where it's just a matter of who was looking at what gene would come out. And there was a sense with the naive, probably inappropriate hubris of scientists that, wow, it's over. Just now a matter of filling in the pieces. I found this, everyone knows. And to a certain extent, there's an element of reality in that. But the story I want to tell is yes, but. So let's pick the X chromosome, since Shannon said, let's not talk about the X chromosome. Let's talk about the X chromosome. So here's the X chromosome. Here's a mapping. It's not actually all the genes that you would fill up. I don't have the display capabilities that you at the Bell Labs have. I probably could have done it, but this is many genes on the X chromosome. And as you can see, what's sort of interesting, here's the sex chromosome. Look at all the different types of diseases, from cell metabolism to the kidney, obesity, blood, that are sitting there on the X chromosome, on the sex chromosome. But the point is, there are thousands of Mendelian diseases, and for the most part, those have been mapped. And that could be a pretty simple story. We have these genes, we have these Mendelian diseases, we match them up, and we have a beautiful map. It's not like that. For any one disease, here let's go in and drill in on obesity. Here's a list of more than a dozen genes that are altered or who contribute to whether obesity is in that individual. Again, that list is not complete. Notice the one on the X chromosome isn't on this list. And the point is, so there's not a one-to-one mapping. It's not, this is the gene for this is the gene for that. We began to realize that there are many, many genes that could map to certain symptoms. And so the complexity of sorting out which one matters, how is this all going to work, became something to solve. And similar to that, I think, transition when Hubble used the telescope and began to realize, it isn't just one galaxy, it's out there, whether it was the physicists who said, okay, I've got an atom that's good enough. For geneticists, for biologists, the other thing that began to happen was that for any one gene that was associated with a disease, there wasn't one mutation in that gene, it was hundreds to thousands. So here is that RB gene, retinoblastoma gene. Here's a map. Again, there's probably 10x that number of mutations now known. So it becomes a problem. Are all those going to cause disease? Will some of them? Where there's a loss of function early, where there's a stop codon early, that's easy to do. But what do you do with one of those mutations that's a single amino acid change in the middle of the protein? Are you going to say that's actionable? So people have begun to deal with that complexity. And in the area of cancer susceptibility, another good one to follow is in BRCA1 and BRCA2, the breast cancer genes. For BRCA1 alone, there are thousands of mutations that have been found. So when someone gets a report back, I found this person has a mutation in that gene, what you want to make sure happens is not that that person assumes that that's going to be an actionable mutation. And so now what people do, and they've begun to do it in open spaces, not in closed companies, which is what was done up until a year ago. There are open repositories where you can go in and you can look at all those mutations. You can look at which ones look like they're associated with disease, and you can take actions off of that type of information. So to summarize sort of where we are, let's start with those Mendelian mutations. Basically, everyone is carrying some sort of loss of function mutations that have the potential to cause serious disease. It is estimated that each of us carry about 300 of those. Many of us 300 different than the next person and the next person. So you're walking around with 300 of your 10,000 plus genes who don't have any function. And each of us have a little different mix, and some of them are new and some of them are old, but they're sitting out there. When you look and talk about individuals at birth, children, about 1 in 100 babies are harboring mutations that will cause catastrophic illness. 1%. 5% of children have some sort of mutations that result in failure to thrive, something that isn't as devastating as whether the individual is going to survive or not. That's 5%, or actually, sorry, 2%. If you come over here, 1 in 5 adults are carrying variants, whether it's for blood clotting or for heart disease or dementia. 1 in 5 of us, so in a room like this, more than 50 individuals are carrying mutations that are basically setting us up for a mutation, something worth trying to identify. And virtually all of us are carrying some sort of mutations that change how we respond if we're going to take, whether it's Tylenol or warfarin or antibiotic, how that drug is going to work within our bodies. So this information has gotten to the point in the last 40 years where there are a lot of things you could do with it. It's clear that it's lined up in general ways, but here's the puzzle that keeps this from getting to be more impactful. Remember that I talked about the experiment with the peas, and there was the equivalent of variable penetrance that you have in the offspring. But there's another phenomenon that's called variable expressivity, which is actually from those same individuals, parents, there are chances that you're not going to just have this polar one phenotype or another, but for many conditions, you have this sort of blend between one extreme of the other. And we have very little idea how that penetrance comes about. Next wrinkle is that the coding part of the genome is a small fraction, sort of like the universe and dark matter. A small fraction of the genome is making up the regions where we code the proteins. And like other systems, you consider it junk unless you realize it has value. So it's considered as junk dark matter. People have begun to look at what it does, and the portions around the gene often determine when it's expressed, how it's expressed, not in the coding region, but just sort of regulated, how it's being able to be expressed. And sometimes these things happen across chromosomes, so there's a whole question of what are we going to do with that. And what that does is it puts a model out there where we have orders of magnitude more facts, but the ability to make a appropriate predictions as to whether that particular mutation in that individual is really going to have a benefit or a risk, and how much of a risk, we should be humbled and realize how early it is. And the tools that many of you use to look at how to find patterns, how to find connections between certain facts and actions is totally ripe now. There's enough data out there to be able to begin to model what is the consequence of these mutations. And I think it will allow us to also look at this difference between nature and nurture. And I want to end this section with two thoughts. The first is that almost all of the association of a particular mutation with an outcome, how does this express itself, the symptoms, has been done unbelievably, naively, assuming that you either have or you don't have a disease, or you have or you don't have a symptom. Almost all this work has been, this is someone who does or doesn't have Alzheimer's. This is someone who does or does not have a cancer. It's obvious that limits the ability to actually interrogate and use that information. And so one of the logical things that is sitting there for anyone to do is to figure out a way to shift from that binary phenotype through to basically leveraging the full spectrum of phenotypes that are sitting there, and that will increase the ability to mesh and to understand what gene is connecting with what gene to give what phenotype. And the wonderful thing is that the sensors, the devices, the ability of tracking not qualitative, biased, subjective data on individuals, but quantitative, repeatable, continuous, multidimensional, quantitative data is the key to actually trying to figure out penetrance. So it's sort of fun. We're 60 years or 70 years away from when Shannon did his thesis. The solidity of the concept of genes and what's going on has come out. We have these maps. But the thing that has popped up from the digital world that is really spectacular is how we could use all these sensors to begin to have multidimensional representations of the phenotype in order to decode that complexity that's sitting there on the genetic component. And that is ripe for anyone who's interested in projects. The other component of it is that if you're going to build an AI system and you're going to try to feed this data into it, there are sort of two different approaches that could be used. One is looking at those appropriate inputs. That's what I just mentioned. But the other is these phenotypes should be seen as continuous actions, and the really fun opportunity is to actually use those continuous measurements over time, not just those multidimensional quantitative objective aspects of those symptoms, and be able to track those in terms of predicting what's going to happen. And I think with those appropriate inputs, with those learning from actions, with the ability to use beyond just simple machine learning, putting in the inputs from the DNA, putting in the inputs from the sensors, I think is going to be a fun playground for anyone who wants to try to work on that. So the remaining issues around predictions, I think, will be more about, for these predictions, how can they be of some benefit? So for that, I'm going to turn to what may be referred to as upside-down thinking. Marcus kindly referred to it a little bit in the intro. Imagine that we have these big tables of genes, mutations, alterations for prediction, and it's coming along. But the whole original idea was that if you knew the gene that was responsible for a particular symptom or for a particular disease, you would be able to cure that disease. Find the gene, cure the disease. And that has been a disaster. There are maybe handfuls of genes where the loss of function has opened up an opportunity to basically do replacement, where you say, I know this product is needed, and I'm going to substitute. I'm going to replace that product and give that back to the individual. And there are, I think, less than a handful of those thousands of diseases where someone has figured out a way where the function is altered, and that's why the disease is there, of bringing in a molecule that actually warps or literally warps the protein structure back to being more functional. Beautiful scientific work, but it's like this tiny fringe for which there's been any ability to identify a way of treating those patients. And so about 5 years or so ago, we were thinking of maybe there were better ways to do this. And the clue that came, sort of like the sitting on the shoulder of which giant analogy, was that in the late 80s, 90s, during the AIDS epidemic that was particularly severe in San Francisco, some astute clinicians realized that some of the individuals who had high levels of HIV, had the virus in them, were not getting AIDS. Again, really small, thin subset, outliers, who had the virus but actually did not go on to get the disease. And they began mapping the genomes of those individuals, looking for what was there. And what they noticed was that there was a protein that acted like a receptor at the surface. And as they found more and more out about it, what they realized, this receptor was the way that the virus got into the white cells. So if you have a mutation there, and the virus can't get into the white cells, you're not going to get AIDS. Have a lot of virus, but you're not going to get that. And that recognition that this is the receptor, CCR5, was there, immediately allowed researchers to ask, are there ways that I could use a small molecule approach to be the equivalent of the mutations that these individuals had that could block the channel? Could you block the channel the way the mutation did? So they did this work, and now one of the leading medicines that are sitting there able to be used for AIDS is this CCR5 inhibitor, because it's going to be able to work for everyone else. So that concept of how can I study those who did not get sick? How could I, instead of the 99.9% of the time where researchers were going, oh, I'm going to take all the individuals who have this disease, the lens switched to, why don't we start looking at those people who should have gotten sick and didn't get sick? Is there a way, sort of interesting, right? How do you find people that should have done something and they didn't? Something about unknown knowns or unknown knowns. The idea that we had was, let's go to pediatric diseases and let's look 3-4 orders of magnitude out from where you'd expect the age for those people to have their symptoms. And let's just look at normal people. And let's see if, when we look at normal people in very large numbers, could we identify the people who actually had mutations and they completely didn't get the disease, so that you would never notice that they were there? And so we picked 120 genes, a little over 500 mutations, and set up a way. We wanted to sort of identify who, whether those individuals were out there that could be found that way. And to do that, we, in the realm of sharing data, decided to go ask the places where the most analysis had been done, where people had been sequenced for some reason and the DNA was there, or there were some clues that were there, and gather, instead of new patients, let's go and gather from samples and from data analysis that had already been done. So we went to 23andMe. They had 500,000 patients, and they kindly offered to give us all of those. So anyone who was at 23andMe at that time, we've looked at your DNA. We went to China. We went to Beijing Genomics. We took a whole set of people from there. We went to the Nordic countries. We went to the UK Biobank. And very quickly, with no work, best experiments are where you can take data that someone else has done and go and screen through. So we did this in months. The largest genetic study ever done, 500,000 people. And we said, I'm just looking for, does that a person have a mutation in this gene or this gene? Not the whole genome, just here, 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 here. And we used those individuals who had whole genome sequencing and those that had phenotyping arrays that covered enough of about half of the genes we were looking for. And very quickly, we were able to find an extremely small number of individuals who fit these criteria. In the end, out of that over 500,000, there were only between 10 and 15, depending upon how you count, examples out of 500,000. But the evidence that that was possible, that those individuals existed out there, and they could be informative for that small set of the genome, right? So that's 100 out of the 20,000 genes that we looked at. And so proof of concept, good start. And then we have since then begun looking at non-pediatric diseases. So this is a project that was written up in the New York Times a couple of years ago where we looked for individuals who should have gotten Alzheimer's disease and they didn't. These are individuals who had a particular mutation in Alzheimer's that they had and their family members had. And this particular individual, Doug Whitney, who I worked with, he had brothers and uncles who had all died in their 40s, and he was 60-some, and he had no evidence of Alzheimer's whatsoever. Why was it that he had the same alteration that all his brothers and uncles had, and he did not? Then what we do is we go in and do whole genome sequencing. We look at what's there, and we pull out something that's a candidate. You can go in and you can grow up cells, and you can test to see whether something has the right property. And so those experiments are going on, not just for pediatric diseases. And at the Icahn School of Medicine over in Manhattan, where I did some of this work with Eric Schott and now Jason Bowe, there's a site, there's a project where we're working on now collecting not 500,000, but millions of individuals, different types of diseases around that same approach. And of course, we did this all around mutations. If you think of the concept of resilience, and you think of what we started with CCR5, there is no reason why this idea of looking at those who should have gotten sick but didn't, you really could extend it to infectious diseases, to many other reasons that you would like to have for whether someone is resilient, and those types of projects are going on. And lastly, I was mentioning this difference between the power that comes in understanding penetrance between using binary phenotypes and looking at digital phenotypes over time. Same advantage of looking at subtle differences in whether someone does or does not have a disease, and resilience, you can imagine, could be applied. The same concept of what is buffering someone could be applied in that resilience project, and you might be able to get to what is still one of the puzzles, which is right now when you tell a person they have a 4 or 80% chance of getting a disease, that person doesn't want to know that. What they want to know is, do I have a real chance, or am I one of those 1 in 5 that is not going to have a chance? They don't want to hear 80% probability. They want to know what. And the way we're going to get there is by doing work such as this. So I'm going to switch to the next section, which is along benefits of thinking in the present. I'm going to go back to Claude Shannon. This is a beautiful palindromic description. We know the past, but we cannot control it. We control the future, but we cannot know it. And it's a beautiful statement, but it also has an element of somberness in it. A little bit of a, that's hard. So what are we going to do? And if you think about it, part of it is that we've left out a description of what about the present. So this next section is going to be about how can the present get us around this issue of the past and the future? What could we know in the moment? And how could that actually benefit and give us ways to predict what was going to go on in the future? Is there an element of knowing and control that comes up in the present that's an opportunity to be able to do things. For the rest of this talk, I'd like to have us picture ourselves as parochial AI machines. Okay, so we're humans, but bottom line is in this skull of ours, we are a parochial AI machine. And the only way we navigate through our days is by using our 5 input, by our 5 lenses, by our 5 senses. That's the only way we know what's out there. It's the only way we can figure out what's going on. And when we're in health, I hope everyone walked into this room thinking, I see reality, I see the stage, it all makes sense, it's all good. But when you get sick, something odd happens because it doesn't fit. The things you thought were okay are not matching. And there is this sense, this is not right, something is wrong. And through the ages, we have gone to individuals, priestly experts, who we go to get healed. I think we go to the cardiac surgeon the way our forebears always went to shamans and medicine men. We go saying, I'm in trouble, and I want you to heal me. And this is an extremely powerful moment, but there's an issue here, which is that what begins, and I as a physician have noted this in the last year a couple of times when some things happened to me, there's this weird thing that our brain does where we go, okay, tell me what to do. There's an asymmetric dialogue that actually gets set up with the physician. And it's almost like a bargain where the idea is, I am here, if you heal me, I'll follow your orders. I'm going to admit I don't know what's going on, and in return, you're going to heal me. And that has some power. You sort of, okay, you deal with it. I'm not going to be able to. At the same time, it prevents individuals from owning where they are and feeling with themselves and empowered. So there's a transfer of agency that is grounded on a contract. So in return for health, I'm going to allow this to happen. That is the way the medical system works today. In return for that transfer of agency, we get these awesome lenses. We get these awesome recipes. But if you think of what separates you from that priestly expert, with the exception of surgeons, where there are tools that sit in there, with the exception of the surgeons, it's about lenses, it's about recipes. And what you assume is that person has the right lenses and the right recipes for me. And I'm going to let them sort of guide me through, sort of tell me what to do. And the interesting things is in trials, people are called subjects. And when you get the information from a doctor, what is it called? Your orders. You follow those orders. So I think it's interesting to think about whether that contract, that transfer of agency, is actually working. And why it isn't working, if it isn't working. And I think it's reasonable to push on it if we don't get what we would like out of that contract. Most of the treatments that are, the trillions of dollars that are spent on disease, most of that are for symptoms, not the actual disease. And when you get a treatment for a disease, it's mostly, this will help you. There's a 30%, there's an 80% chance this will help you. There's not a knowledge, this is going to help you. And often, it's looking at symptoms. How am I going to treat that symptom? So I'm going to argue that actually that contract is okay, but it's not like working the way you would normally have a contract working. We should ask, are there other ways to do that? What you really would like to have is a more symmetric dialogue. You would like to have something more like a co-pilot, where the expert comes in and their job is to help you, but it's to help you, not this is what I want you to do. So I think we need to, as technologists, think of how is it possible to shift that asymmetric dialogue to a more symmetric one, particularly in navigating between health and disease. So this diagram, which is used for another purpose, shows a description of what you would like to have. You would like to have a way of displaying the contour map between health and disease. You would like to know if I have that triple cheeseburger or those 2 Dunkin' Donuts or the chips or whatever, am I going off course? You would like to know if I go and I meditate, or if I go and I run, or if I go and I do this, is that moving me towards or not towards there? And the way to do that is probably not to use the existing cohort studies that are used, but instead to come up with a new way of collecting data. So as an example, I think there's a beautiful prototype. This is less than a year old. This group just keeps growing. There's a small startup that is led by Tom Insel, used to be the head of the NIMH, is now at Verily. His daughter said, why don't we ask people whether they would like to help each other? She started this site called 7 Cups of Tea. This is about people who are depressed or having mood issues. And she said, let's actually have the people who are having issues learn from each other and both give advice and get advice at that co-piloting level. And let's see what happens where you don't have a priestly expert that's driving it, but actually people learning from each other. She started this site, and last time I looked, it had just gone over 1 million users. It's unbelievable how just has gone viral. 1 million people collecting it. Look there if you want to have a live example of what happens when people who are having issues on mood are actually not seen as just the person who is sick, but actually have something to share with another. Very important energy, very important thing to tap into. I dream about changing how guidelines are set. So right now, sitting behind the priestly expert is what advice to give. And that advice comes from guidelines. When someone says, I'm going to give you insulin, or I'm going to suggest that you go on an anticoagulant, that parochial AI machine that sits in that physician's head is not conjuring it up. It's coming out of only coming from the data that sits in studies that said, I took this many patients, and when I did this, I learned this. When I took Framingham Heart Study, and I studied these individuals, and they changed their diet, this happened. Or an example of looking at cardiovascular disease, 26 years here, atrial fib. So the reason why the experts are experts is that they know how to refer to recipes that have been done very likely not on you. Okay? So who says that that actually is something that's going to help you? And so the alternative is to say, I wonder if there's a way where those who get sick are the ones who build the knowledge base. Could you build an exploratorium where people, as they are having issues come up, are actually the ones who are providing data, not just about the symptoms, because by the time the symptom comes up, it's too late. What you really want is you want the context. You want all the things that happened before the 95% failure rate that turned something into a liver not working or a kidney not working, et cetera. And the only way you're going to get that data is not out of electronic medical records. It's not going to work. The only way you're going to get that data is to actually have contextual information. And this is a great debate that sort of has been at a subconscious level this week. Potentially passive data complemented by trigger context, not just passive data. Very interesting question whether of how to do that. And I think that the difference between getting something that will actually be likely to work is going to be in proportion to how many doppelgangers you can find out there that will actually give you a clue of whether that's something you should do. That's where we're going. A lot of people will ask, what sensor should we use to help in this exploit? And I would say, don't do heart rate, don't do this, don't do that. Well, you do those, but I think we have to be a little more creative. When you look at a picture like this, it is not hard to see that these kids have something in common. What's really fun is it stays over age. What I wish we were building was assessment for things like vitality. We need to come up with ways of looking at people and how to help them have that resilience, how to be able to know where they are in their life. And I think we have to think of integrated symptoms and tracking those. So anyone who has an interest in working on vitality, I will take that phone call 24/7 who wants to work on that. Right? I think that's the level at which you can work on things. The fly in the ointment is that actually this is good, but how many people own a scale? How many people have lost weight because the scale has helped them? Okay? No, it's about that. It's about 10%. Okay? 90%. So showing someone an assessment of what is happening with them, and there's a direct correlation between weight and obesity. You know, it's just sort of direct. Okay? So you can't, well, it's not really what causes me to get fat. You don't listen to it. The harder, let me back up. I think that the engineering needed to collect the assessments is literally a matter of time, not whether. All the assessments we could do. What I'm concerned about is not enough people are thinking about what would you do if you could make that assessment. What are you going to do with it? How is that going to actually help someone to surface some particular fact that as an engineer you've gotten excited, ha, I can follow X. And I think we have to put more time into what we do with those assessments. There's sort of two components of looking at why people do things, and they are entwined between elements of agency, which is why it's in the title, and motivation. There's a beautiful book that came out this past year by Kevin Kelly, one of the editors of Wired. I highly recommend reading it. It has 12 components that they say in our age, he declares are inevitable. Things that actually we cannot stop. They're going to happen. And one of them is filtering. The barrage of data that comes at us all the time is one that you can't possibly consume. Well, actually, I shouldn't say it. Good luck. And I would worry what would happen if you did consume. So filtering is a powerful tool to basically allow some personalization in order to anticipate desires. So filtering is an important component, but also the ability to change behavior by appealing to our non-rational motivations, our emotional triggers and unconscious biases is very important. So the last several years, those who have talked about the difference between the equivalent of, what I feel in my reptilian brain and what I feel or what I know in the cortex has actually become a science. And what we realize is the decisions that we make of whether we're going to do things are not just running around in the cortex in our consciousness, but just as importantly, what's going on in the midbrain, forebrain, subconscious decisions. And instead of this being hypothetical, this is from yesterday's or the day before's paper. Companies are beginning to realize how extremely powerful it is to actually manipulate people, to have people change their behaviors, to know where they are without them even being aware of it at all. And I'm concerned about that. There's a great pair of articles. Facebook targets insecure kids. Facebook rejects claim it targets insecure teens. Yeah. Someone on the PR team, I'm going to make sure we got a companion article, came out. I do not mean to impugn Facebook. I'm trying to refer to a very important fact, and it actually comes around to what has been happening, and I think probably was happening in the last election, which is the ability to influence people in ways where they don't know that you don't know you're being influenced. And as we live more and more in a world where we are having filtering all the time, where choices are brought up, we're going to need to have tools, one of which I saw a little bit of earlier today, where there's a choice of what's going on. And in reference to agency and free will, I think it's really important to ask, should we be aware, should we be responsible, even if we don't do a very good job of it, do we want to keep the responsibility with the individual for the decisions that they're making? This representation that comes from a trip I took to Tehran in November, Mariza, an artist there, I thought captured this. The first is a glass or skull, and inside, I don't know if you can see it, it's my camera, they're jigsaw puzzles. And the concept is that we have to put reality together that way. And then this other image of what's in our head or not, I think I'm using to try to convey to you what a precious component we have in terms of how we use our own head or consciousness to make decisions. And I think we're going to have a debate about the efficiency of getting people to do things when they don't know what's going on, the efficiency of that, and thinking that actually has implications that are not good. And so the same way as food has nutritional facts, when you buy a package of food, I'm wondering whether when you consume thoughts, would it be a good idea to have some sort of consumer information tag on what was done to the filtering that led to that? Wouldn't it be nice to have a consumer report equivalent tag when you're consuming information of what was the starting material and how you got there? And I think that demand to go, I need to see that. I want to know how you say that is or is not fake news. I'd like to see that. And I think we should think about that. I want to turn now to doing and pausing. The technological tools that have us living differently than 10, 20 years ago, which have this awesome capabilities to enhance our lives. At the same time they're providing those benefits, I think we need to think of some of the negative issues that come from those. The chance that people have parsed their day into intervals of time, that they're going to do this and they're going to do that, et cetera, is squeezing us. And it's squeezing us from the time that's most valuable, which is the time we're pausing. That's why that quiet chamber that we have next door to us is what I'm going to go into when I finish this lecture. Right, Dunal? Yeah, I want to go in that chamber. It's interesting. This issue has been around for about 100 years. I think many of you have seen Metropolis and that description of it. But in order to represent that and the concern, I think it's worth thinking of endangered experiences the way we think of endangered species. So right now, when you have a species that you consider it's endangered species, there are certain laws and protections that come back to make sure that doesn't go extinct. Maybe we should designate endangered experiences and think of what those are and how important they are and ways to protect them. And there is a photographer in North Carolina that you may have seen, Eric Pixergill, who is, I think, doing a pretty good job of showing what happens to us and the world we're living in that we just don't see. We don't even notice. So this is actually Eric and his wife in bed. Notice his hand by the clicker. Wonderful artist. You can go on his website to look at those photographs. Here's another example. He's got about 50 of these. They're awesome. They help us see how weird our world is, whether we're sitting on a train or a bus or at a stop or things like that. And what I fear is that we're losing that time to have the dialogue with ourselves. So if we're going to have an alternate to someone filtering and going at a midbrain level and turning us, I think the only hope we have is to make sure that we have those times with ourselves. This picture of this girl in 57 is the exact age I was when I was growing up in New York City. And I remember the free time. I remember the time when I wasn't doing anything and how powerful that was. And I think we need it as adults. I think we need it as individuals. And it's shrinking. In 1909, again, people who thought about it long ahead of time, I just want to highlight this statement by E.M. Forrester, who you'll know for other stories. I don't know if you know this story called The Machine Stops, but I think he says it pretty well here. Man, the flower of all flesh, the noblest of all creatures visible, man who had once made God in his image and had mirrored his strength on the constellations, beautifully naked man was dying, strangled in the garments that he had woven. Century after century had he toiled, and here was his reward. Truly, the garment had seemed heavenly at first, shot with colors of culture, sewn with the threads of self-denial. And heavenly it had been so long as man could shed it at will and live by the essence that is his soul, and the essence equally divine that is his body. I think we have to ask, what is it that anticipates that, and how can we help prevent that? One of my colleagues, Miklu Silvanto, said something that a year ago I don't think I would have appreciated, which he said, I grew up believing that capitalism, liberalism, and technology would usher in the inevitable, delightful future. I think I grew up that way, and my guess is that many of you in the audience grew up thinking, capitalism, liberalism, technology, that's our solution. We're gonna pull it off. I now see these as precious tools that are non-neutral and can either help or hurt. So what I mean by that is the economic growth on which capitalism rests has a potential of driving the need for growth, of driving us to where a system collapses under consumption. And we need to think about that. So it's not the capitalism itself, it's like what happens because of. And similarly, with regard to liberalism, the freedom to express yourself, the freedom to do this or that, has an awesome opportunity. But it also, at the time that you have an embracing of diversity, that toleration of hate and the ability for people to take advantage of it, we should remember. And with the technology, it has that opportunity to enhance, but it also has an opportunity to constrict. And in those last 105 or 106 years, I've been spending time thinking of what happens in the difference between whether you trust someone or what happens when the presence of violence, whether it's in the news or other places, has you beginning to fear. And you switch in terms of how you feel about yourself, how you feel about others. I'm just recommending that if you haven't read this book on tyranny by Tim Snyder, that you do that. So I want to ask, do we have an incumbent responsibility as designers of technology to protect these endangered experiences and how we use technology? In The Matrix, the movie The Matrix, if you remember, there was this concept that our view of reality was configured, and people were able to sort of interact through that matrix. One way to think of what happens in going through our days is that we have an ability to consider that matrix is a solid matrix and that there's no learning around it and that we should take it as it is, or we can recognize that matrix actually can be fluid. And when it is fluid, when that matrix is fluid, when you question it, you have an ability to do self-discovery. And so I think there's this beautiful opportunity of sort of switching back and forth of how we want our world. Do we want it all where there are known answers, where there are known facts, where everything is understood? Do we want to entertain some fluidity that allows that self-discovery? I bring that up because in medicine, the structure, that medical industrial complex that exists, is one that assumes that there are experts and you're going to follow that order and this is the way the knowledge is, that asymmetry. And many of the aspects of that are on that scale between fundamental and exploration. And the ability to move that wheel is something to think about. And the same thing's true in education. Schools can either be, I'm going to give you these facts, I'm going to give you these rules, you're going to learn this, I'm the teacher, do this, or they can be opportunities for people to explore, to learn, to discover. Last segment is that Claude Shannon gave another beautiful quote on a time about dogs and robots. I'm not going to read this. The initial design and information storage that we achieved when we became multicellular organisms about 3 billion years ago got completely switched 5,000 years ago when you could actually write down information and where information, knowledge, and design became separated from biology but contingent upon humans. What has just happened in the last 10 years is actually a further uncoupling. Now, knowledge, wisdom, and design can occur in a digital space that's actually independent of humans. And it is defined by humans, allowing evolution beyond humans. Why that's, I think, important is that knowledge and wisdom, design, when it's occurring in digital space, there is a shift to a multi-component non-human organism as critical to evolution as the finding of multicellular life. In the title is this description of free will, this ability to look at good and bad. And the definition has in there a description of free will as without constraint of necessity or one's own discretion. Going back to what I said originally about us thinking of ourselves today as parochial AI machines, design and free will, that without constraint at one's discretion, today we navigate the world as these parochial AI machines, recognizing that there are benefits and risks of having a central AI machine which is actually able to make those decisions. And you could argue that better decisions could be made by that central AI machine, but it's a very different concept of free will. It's a very different concept of agency and at one's own discretion. So where does that tag of at one's own discretion go when you go from each of us being a parochial AI machine to is it the central AI machine's discretion? Is that where it goes? Is that central AI machine do it for us? Are we going to say that that's something we want to keep for ourselves? So free will of and by an individual is very likely already an endangered experience, and we need to think about that. Several years ago, I came across this spectacular 1888 woodblock print from meteorologic text the woman wrote in Paris. And I thought, oh, I know what this means. This is that transition in the Dark Ages between those that were sort of living, thinking of the fact that the world was preordained and sort of in the world of forces that were beyond our control. And this was an example of someone entering the age of reason and how lucky that was. I think that at the same time, you could look at where we are in our evolution and say that we are actually exiting a world where the data, the risks, the information that we have is putting us in a digital world pretty much out of phase, out of scope with who we were through all of evolution trying to navigate. And I think it has a different mood to it now than it did when I was looking at it as escape from the Middle Ages. You know, what's it going to be like as we leave this world where we've had our own lenses and made our decisions that way? So just to close, I want to give a couple of quick art projects because I hope they link in. Several years ago, I felt as if some of the mistakes I was making in my life were because I was rushing through it, and I was thinking that I needed to always be finding an opportunity and sort of scanning and searching. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if you could build a rear-view mirror for your life, where when you're trying to make decisions of going forward, could you somehow represent what life had been for you? Because it's only about every 1 or 2 times a year that when you look back on your life, there was something that was really a valuable shift in who you were. I'm not talking about I had a birth or I had a wedding. I'm talking about where you change who you are. And if you had a way to actually acknowledge that and put it in as a rear view mirror to remember, it seemed like it would be valuable. So back in 2011, spent a year sort of collecting data, working with an artist on could I come up with a way of looking at intent and chi and essence? Could I start dividing my life into sort of what I had learned, how I acted? These are real notes from back then about the things that really I had learned or I felt were important to how to grow. Neil Young, am I in the process of what Neil Young meant when he said, "You will come around"? Started collecting those things, started trying to organize them into various things that were worth reminding myself, dividing my life not by decade, but by ways that I went about living and working with other people. Notice the bolded one. I'm in the cultivating seeds, solo flights of impact now, I feel. And began trying to come up with ways to visualize that so that it would make sense to me, trying to come up with little icons or patterns that might fit and give a way of representing various components. And then working with Courtney Lipscomb, turning that into a pastel that she could work from. And then she spent 9 months straight taking 55,000 microbeads and building up the analogy of that. So she would take the painting, the pastel on the bottom, put in the microbeads on the top, draw in and put in jewels or shells or this or that, and sort of building this whole thing up. And that's Courtney working away. And it ended up being 100 inches long, 2 inches wide. And when I looked at it, I thought, God, this is awful. This is so egotistical. It's totally wrong. So we stopped, we went back, and we built a backlit 2 feet by 12 feet long backlit image of the sky where we worked with the guys at Microsoft to capture the birth of stars and the death of stars, to put a little more context that, this isn't just one person, things like that. And in order to get a sense of sort of how I feel when I'm there, I want to play a small bit of music that comes from Eric Whitaker, who built the virtual choir by taking 183 people who didn't know each other, capture their individual voices, put it all together, did a virtual choir, because for 10 seconds I want you to get a sense of sort of what that feels like. A chance for you to think about what you would put on your rearview mirror. So that was one piece. Just really quickly, been concerned about this aspect of owning unknown unknowns. I think all of us were impacted by Guantanamo Bay and by the Syrian refugees. For me, it was the images of the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay with the barbed wire, with the razor wire around them. I couldn't get out of my head, and I didn't know how to feel about myself as an American, having that go on. With the Syrian refugees, the images that we'd see in the news about how we treated each other, and felt as if there was a need to acknowledge what Hannah Arendt has talked about, which is the good and bad that gets done in the world is a lot of it by not being aware of things or not acknowledging or denying things. So took the phrase from the Bible that says, forgive us for we know not, or forgive them for they know not what they have done, converted it into micro neon with a razor wire and built this piece, which I have in my house to try to, like the rearview mirror, remind me that it's the things that we're not paying attention to that we should. It's very easy to lead our lives and flush things out of it. And then the last slide is the last week, I've been lucky enough to be working on a project, which I'm not going to describe for time, which is on cosmic microwave background radiation and how to see invisible things, how to make noise so it can be beautiful. So this lecture was one which had some strange terms in it, agency, et cetera. Like to leave people with a sense of thinking about what are the incumbent responsibilities that we have to ourselves, to each other, to society, as designers of technology to protect endangered experiences, and as artists to enable all to feel these issues. Thank you very much.
I normally make a joke at this point, but it's not a jokey talk. It is the bravest talk I think I've ever seen. I don't know about you, because it starts with science and medicine and goes all the way into politics and philosophy and who we are as people. So I think a second round of applause for that. It's just amazing. You thoroughly earned the statue I'm going to give you later, although it feels a bit inadequate. So I'm going to start the questions. One immediately occurs to me from your ending, with the part about forgive them for they don't know what they do. But in a digital era, we will know more about what we are doing. So is that both the problem, because it allows us to become physically disconnected, and so we feel that we have no obligation to the other end of a digital pipe. I think that is an effect, and this is the thing we talk about with BT a bit, is if it's the other end of a digital pipe, I'm not really connected to you because I never had a sense of fully expressive connection to you. But on the other hand, I do know about you, and you know about me. I just don't care like I used to. How do you resolve those two things?
I'm not sure how you resolve those. I think the problem is really an important one. One thought is it used to be that when something came into your realm, you almost had a balanced opportunity to do something about it. Something came into your village or something like that. By that I mean the frequency of horrible things that would actually enter your world and you would feel responsible for was low.
Yeah.
And
because community had boundaries and protected you and lived in a certain existence.
Exactly. Yeah. So this flooding of all these things continuously has a real danger of having us become mute. There's nothing I can do. So what I'm most worried is that the sort of the banality of these horrors, meaning
yes.
the frequency of them, is numbing us and overwhelming us to the point where I can't possibly deal with that. So I think we have to come up with a way of not letting that happen, of feeling connected, and of not someone choosing what it is that are the ones we're going to respond to. Right? Somehow where it's not we don't use filtering as we'll only show these things.
So if I extend that point a bit, let's say we could transfer a fully sensory experience that was equivalent to the community experience. Frequency is still higher.
Yep.
But now what I send you is a fully sensory experience that appalls you or delights you for the positive things. Am I forced by my humanness to react to that in a way that I'm not? It's banal today because it's only monosensory. It's a video image.
Yep.
I look away. I've seen horror films. They look just as bad. It's disconnected from me, so it's probably not really happening. It's some movie somewhere. Or it's a set of people who I just feel disconnected from. So even though you see them as humans, you move on. It's the Good Samaritan thing in some ways. Right? Yeah. If I could transmit a fully sensory experience, I couldn't turn away. Does that help?
Yeah, I hope so. And I think that it's sorely needed. So this concept of the remoteness of it and bringing it closer and the power of that and being able to get to react. But at the same time, I think we have to anticipate the equivalent of being in continuous post-traumatic stress syndrome from feeling all that all the time. So I think to get people to have more proximal and to really have our senses connect, that's beautiful. We have to do that. As we do that, we may overwhelm people And so we should simultaneously thinking of the beauty of having that directness, and at the same time,
the despair.
Yeah.
So, but then back to, and then I'll open it to the audience because it's not just about you and me, it turns out. The AI system. So if I had what Chris, and you talked to Chris, calls augmented intelligence systems, that's there to help you, not to replace you. So if that system was trusted by you to select the number of objects that you could consume as an individual, and that is an individual thing. Some people are incredibly empathetic and would be overwhelmed by one. For me, since I'm British and I've had every emotion distilled down to me, I would need to see a lot of stuff. But is that the answer, that I need an intelligent agent who will select the frequency, not whether I see them or not, but the frequency that matches me?
I love the choice in the system that Chris showed. This was a way where if you're trying to explore and understand, you're not driven by something else. You drive. It's more about being in the driver's seat to make those connections. And that's extremely valuable. And I think, I should just say, and I think that is so far in the right direction that we need to be able to get there. I'll stop there. It was really pretty.
Great. To the audience, if we can have the lights up, it's just a little easier for us to see you. There you go. There's quite a few of them. Okay, Bob.
Mike, here we go.
If there's a mic there for you.
He's going first because he's a Senior Bell Labs alum.
Very senior. I'm reading this wonderful book, which I don't know whether you've read, called Homo Deus.
Yes, absolutely. I had a very hard time not putting Yuval Harari's book in, and now that you said it, I wish I had, because it's influenced me. So tell me why you brought it up. I'm really excited to hear where you're going to go with that, because I think he's awesome.
Yeah.
Both Homo sapiens and
Homo
or
Deus.
sapiens and Homo Deus.
Yeah.
Just spectacular.
Yeah.
Sorry, Yuval.
He has this thesis that our century has been dominated by humanism and the value of the individual, and that the growing role of technology is such that it will overwhelm that role.
Yep.
And that he paints a very uncertain and kind of frightening future to where technology takes over more and more jobs, more and more decisions. You know, you would like the patient to have more of a role, and he says, no, that ain't going to happen. Your AI in the sky is going to have more in a role. And I was interested in your views on his.
So I love his thinking. Anyone who has not picked up Sapiens or Homo Deus, they go really as a beautiful pair. I actually want to have a dialogue with him because I disagree with him on 2 points. I disagree that the fact that the AI, the central AI, as opposed to the parochial AI machine, can get it correctly all the time is worth, therefore, giving up the fallible, foible-laden parochial AI decisions that we make. When that happens, we become the mitochondria of the cell. We become the, do you know what I'm saying? Of a multi-component AI organism, okay? Right? And I think that there are, this is a species-specific, biased, subjective description. I think we're worth keeping,
That's
even if we make, even if we're making mistakes. And the other thing that I disagree with him on, in terms of the element of free will, I think his sense is grow up, right? We never had it. I mean, in some ways, it was an illusion that we ever had any decisions to make, and we're waking up to that. And you humanists, I don't agree. And I'd love to have a discussion or dialogue of what is it about how we do our thinking that is maybe based on the mistakes that we make, the things we don't quite get right, which are just okay. So I think he is someone that I have enormous respect for. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, we're actually inviting him for one of these future lectures.
Oh, wonderful.
We haven't set up. In which
Well,
case
I'll come to
you're coming
Princeton.
back.
There you go.
Okay,
I came because
Martin.
Speedy was here. I'll come back.
So one of the big problems in the world today is that there's a very large number of people who are willing to believe incredibly stupid things from incredibly stupid and manipulative people.
Yep.
Is there a gene for that?
I thought you were going to say, is there a resilience?
I would like to submit myself in the resilience study. And I'm rooting for the dogs.
Wasn't even a question in the end, but it was very good.
Very nice.
Martin. So what I will turn that into a question.
Yeah.
In complex scenarios, does the intelligence of the people become an important factor that causes mass behavior, assuming average intelligence equals mass behavior, that is more harmful than in the past, where intelligence and the ability to consume and understand these multifaceted stimuli is now in a select few, so we get more conflict between those two bodies?
Absolutely. That's not a sort of. It's absolutely. And I don't think we even. I don't think we can begin. I think we need to recognize the severe shift in the power of how information ends up modifying sort of how people are reacting. Not just at the conscious, but at this forebrain level. The one I'm really worried about is the things where you don't notice that you're wondering, why am I wanting to park by that Dunkin' Donuts? Right? Those are the types of things. And there's so much money and so much power that sits in the ability to do that, that I think we have to think very carefully about.
And that power is in a rarefied space of highly motivated corporations and people and whatever it is who want you to behave that way, drive you to behave that way, and then wonder why when they've driven you to behave that way, you no longer actually account for yourself. You no longer exhibit agency. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, we're going to be diverse.
Yes, hello. Today is May the 4th, so I couldn't avoid saying May the 4th be with you. And
I don't know where this came from, but it seems to be a thing.
I knew it was coming.
I've seen it on Facebook, so it must be a
not
thing.
another way.
And your comment about vitality really intrigued me, because I was wondering if at some point we will be able to see in the genome that vitality. Is that what is triggering your interest?
The triggering the interest, it could be. The thing that was triggering my interest is, I think of there as being raw data that we're learning how to turn into, I'm going to call it biometric vocabulary, that can get turned into clinical vocabulary that can get turned into symptoms. What do people want? They want to be able to follow symptoms and how am I doing in my world, right? They're not interested in clinical vocabulary, they're not interested in biometric. And I think our sensors are primarily coming up with biometric vocabulary, coming up with clinical symptoms. But if I wanted to have something that everyone could leave here and be able to track, certainly one of those I would want to have is how am I doing on my vitality and what can I do to restore it? Because on that nature-nurture component, the one thing we have under our control is the things we can do to keep it so we have vitality. Now, some of that's going to come from the genes, but I think the way you think, the way you treat yourself, what you consume, I don't mean food, other things are under our control and have a chance of giving us an element of resilience by how we treat ourselves. And if we had a way to sort of assess that on the dashboard, I think that would be so awesome and would help people across so many aspects of navigating.
Which ties to your argument about time to have an experience, a quiet moment, go into the anechoic chamber, which now you all have access to because I think we all need it. But that then is part of vitality, you would argue.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay, let's go further back. So the people at the front, go ahead. Song Wen, I think, there.
Hi, I really like that lecture a lot, and particularly how you frame it as the future of human agency. In particular, the endangered experiences that you mentioned. This is sort of a simple question, hopefully as a precursor for a longer discussion, but is there a particular endangered experience that you feel like is the key experience to preserve or the one to focus on?
I don't know if it's the key one, but for me, the one I've been feeling is the time where you get to have a dialogue with yourself. So whether it's the shower, whether it's 4 a.m., I think each of us, but boy, out of 24 hours a day, I feel really lucky if I have 3-5 minutes of a dialogue with myself. When's the last time you had, were able to pause enough to have a dialogue with yourself about what's going on? And I think that motivation, non-AI driven, subliminal motivation will come from being able to give people that pausing that will allow them to have a dialogue with themselves that says, I should do this, I shouldn't do that. And that's where I'd love to see our decisions be able to be guided more at that level. So I think the endangered experiences are those times we don't have a dialogue with ourselves.
So I'll actually answer when it is for me. It's actually planes, weirdly enough, because you're not connected to many things there. And I also use music, so I don't hear what's going on in the plane. But the music I select is also designed to be a trigger to the thought I want to have. Right? Because certain music works at certain points in time. So it acts as a drowner out. I don't care for noise-canceling headphones because I'm interested in more than that. So that's how I do it. And actually, that's why plane rides are not so bad for me. Yeah, it's isolation time.
I call it my 33,000-foot meditation.
There you go. Which is why, you're our savior, apparently.
No, I think for many people who are frequent travelers, shame on you if you have a ability to use your Twitter account while you're on the plane.
Exactly. Don't pay for the Wi-Fi, everyone. Don't pay for the Wi-Fi. Just zone out. Mike.
I guess my question is that with all of this data, don't you see that capitalism has a really powerful effect of negatively impacting, because you're going to be tracing all of this information at the genetic level? And I just wonder what your thoughts are on
go one. I think so, but go one more sentence into because. Right? Can you take that question and go one more sentence? Because, for example, can you just, because I think I know what you're talking about.
Well, I think I'm talking more about, like, if I donate I go to 23andMe and I give my sample, and now all of a sudden they say, oh, you have a high percentage of Alzheimer's, say.
Yep.
And then I suddenly find out that my insurance policy is now going to go up because of the fact that I have this.
You have knowledge of a pre-existing condition-ish or predisposition.
Right. And so, and now it's going to have even more, because now we're going to look at resiliency and we're going to look at all these other things, and we're going to have this broad spectrum of information. And I think that there's a real risk that there's not going to be protections for privacy as an individuals.
I think we need to worry about those protections. I think the things that we don't pay attention to that surround it are all the atrocious things that are already done all the time with our private information. And I see it as one more example of things that are turning into commercial benefit, not a leading cause. And so I think it's important to do that. But I think most people don't realize how much of their credit card transactions, when they go to CVS, when they go to this, when they go to that there's just streaming out for benefit, and I would put those aspects of the genetic in that bucket. I think that the safeguards on the insurance are real, but I think that there is so much other medical information that also should be pulled under that we should talk about health information and how that gets used, and instead of making it a separate issue, it comes under that.
So you're not arguing for money under the mattress and home remedies?
Right. No, I'm not.
No.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, there was a security in both those things, right? And so we have to find the new solution. Yes, go ahead. We're going to do a couple more questions, and then we have to get Stephen
So these are very
to a couple.
interesting times, right? The convergence of mathematics and biology and science. So I was thinking about, symptoms like autism, right? It is in some ways the detection of signal from noise. And some people, they're not able to focus well in group settings. What they infer, what I would infer is very different from what somebody else and what is the norm. So you can have predictive treatments as well. Like you hit upon a point. Nature is not binary, right? It is a state of nature. It's a Bayesian state. So if I want to really treat somebody, maybe he is 10%, there's a 90% probability he's going to develop the disease. So why not I start treating him beforehand? A normal doctor might not, but somebody could actually cause the gene to kind of stay in a better state. So where is science on those kind of treatments? So this is kind of a, again, it's not a binary answer to it.
But that's the great potential, of course, is that, right? Is that we start modifying in advance.
One more simpler issue.
You're going to have to speed up a bit then.
Yes. Now, I come from India, right? There's a lot of pollution there. Why doesn't every phone have a pollution monitoring warning in it? You can have an oxygen sensor, and that can be done pretty quickly. And I'm sure Bell Labs can also help in collecting that data, because, 500 million people are affected by pollution. So if you avoid these things, when I first came to this country, I never knew Coke was that bad. I'm scientific enough, but you're not aware. And I would guzzle 2 or 3 Cokes a day, right? So that's the simpler problem. The first one I've asked was the little more, complex, but
there are ways to anticipate the full symptoms and to begin treating. Absolutely. That's, as you said. There's another thing which I think we have to allow, which is some people may feel as if what you consider a distressing symptom may be one that they want to be with. And I think that's another thing, is that who are we to say that something that's off from norm is not something that someone wants to have as a state? So I just want
to... Yeah, and I rather like that's why I like the noodle view of the world, because the noodle view doesn't say there's an answer. It says you are a complex set of functions. And if my thing is just a little bit out there, but it's still okay, and I like it out there, that's not wrong.
That's right.
And so if you could then map that into a vitality function that said, given you're happy with this map of your life, what is the vitality activities you could embark upon to maintain or even improve that? It would be fascinating. All comes back to Chris in the end, doesn't it, it seems? But Sanjay's been actually very patient for him, so we'll go with Sanjay.
I'm ready.
He rolled up his sleeves.
Well,
I've
spent a couple of days with him, and he's truly a friend now. But
so from your point of view?
From my point of view.
Both points.
How he feels is completely different.
Sanjay's my ATP.
No, but what a range from Mendelian diseases to free will. And a couple of questions along that line. One is, again, somewhat similar to the question that was asked, is rather than the binary phenotype, if the disease or non-disease is eventually the outcome, is it a matter of saying somebody is 5 mutations away from that needle flipping or 10 mutations away from a needle flipping? And is it the rise of probability through as you age that flips the needle or not? And if there are things that can be done to prevent those mutations, that may be therapy that may be started saying, look, it's in your genotype or it's in your, the blockers are not there, but I can prevent the necessary mutations from taking. Is that a line of therapy? Is it the right way of thinking about it?
Let's pick it up later. The part that it feels most ripe is in cancer, where if you know that these two genes are going to end up, separate genes are going to end up being important, and you're already out here, I think there are things you could think of for a particular tumor of a sort of preparing. For many other things outside of cancer, let's talk about it, because I'm not getting it as closely.
Okay, we're going to wrap up there. We have the statue. Yeah, what you get, other than a donation to a charity of your choosing, is you get to take this home, which normally causes people to be perturbed that they now have to check their bags. but we will actually mail it to
Okay,
you
okay.
as well. This is the Shannon
I don't think
Luminary-
this is the time to test things on the airlines right now.
Especially such a strange object.
Exactly.
Right. So well done. Thank
No,
you so
thank
much.
you very
It was a
much.
wonderful, wonderful lecture.
Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Stephen will remain here for a few minutes, then we're going to whisk him away and do an interview with him. So, 5 minutes or so, Ellen? That was 10.